This is the Badland APEX remote wireless winch control. We're here to talk about adapting this, that's the hack, to use for any winch that you might have, whether it has a 3-pin controller or a 5-pin controller. This is fairly easily adaptable to your application. So let's talk about the remote here real quick. Magnetic, which is nice. You can stick it on your hood or your tailgate and forget about it and then lose it in the mud. This little remote seems to be really well made. It's sturdy. I opened this up and it's not really like water sealed, so you definitely don't want to drop it in water, but it does have this little protective cover on it which comes off. And then you've got a mode button which you press and hold that until it comes up. This uses CR-2032, the little flat lithium 3-volt batteries, so they're easily purchasable at basically any store that sells batteries. So anyway, let's get into what I did to make this work with my Warn M8000 winch in this case, but don't take the winch specifically as it has to be that winch. Really, like I said, any winch that you have out there, whether it came with a wired control or some wireless control that's maybe not working so great for you anymore, this can work. Along with setting up the winch with the Harbor Freight hack, I picked up one of these guys. This replaces all the solenoids that you might be struggling to keep in order on your old winch. So this is just called a DC Contactor or a solid state winch controller, and it uses these 4 lugs, and then there's 3 pins here. These are kind of your general 3 pins, ground, in and out, on the contactor here to make this replace those solenoids and control all the current that flows through your winch. Looking at this little wireless receiver, you can kind of see the Sharpie on here. I've pinned these out, and there's the 5 pins. And if you're familiar with winches, you probably know what the 5 pins are, but they're of course ground, in and out, which is just a trigger signal coming out of this to go to either your solenoid pack or, like I showed you, the DC contactor. The other 2 pins are a constant power and a switched power. So the constant power can be drawn right off of that DC contactor, as I'll show you. The switched power, you're going to want to connect to a 12-volt switch somewhere in your system that you can either have it come on with the ignition if you want, or I would suggest having it, like an arm switch that you can set to arm your winch. As far as the trigger, I'm setting up, this is just kind of an additional option that I'm doing, is setting up this thing that you can actually get on the BleepinJeep store. This is called the VO switch, and you can see relays, fuses, and outputs. So this connects to your battery, and then you've got a controller that operates this with 1 wire that goes to the controller, 1 bundle of wires I should say, and makes a nice clean install. So my winch is going to have an arm switch on that controller to turn the wireless guy on and off. I just used a small drill bit to poke little like 1/16 inch holes into this plug. And you want them to at least roughly align with the pins. And then before you put any terminal on your wire, you want to go ahead and put all 5 of your wires through this rubber grommet. And you can see that's a pretty nice tight fit just for the wire itself. And when this is, for this to work, this has to be choked all the way up on these connectors. So they're really stretching the rubber when they come through there, and that's going to make a nice watertight seal, and be a good idea here as well when we're finished to go ahead and load this up with some silicone. And the particular heat shrink tubing that I'm using here has adhesive inside. So I can put a link to this little tubing kit This is really handy to have around if you ever do more automotive electronic stuff. You can see perfectly on that one where some of the adhesive came out the end as it was shrunk. So the adhesive makes a real watertight bond. It also makes the heat shrink a little bit thicker, which can be helpful in some circumstances. And you see I'm running, normally you wouldn't do this, but I'm running the heat shrink all the way to the end of the connector, and in some of these cases it was past the end of the connector, and then I had to trim it with a knife. I'm also, for these, removing the plastic collar. So the terminals that I used to connect to the pins on the wireless receiver are these little 22 to 16 gauge spade connectors. These were the smallest that I could find, and they fit the pins perfectly. For connecting to the controller terminals on the DC contactor for in and out, I used 16 to 14 gauge of the same spade connector type plugs. As you would expect, we got to strip the end of the wire. The smallest piece that will smoothly fit over the wire. And then the next piece we don't have to put on ahead of time because it needs to fit over the entire terminal. Make sure your crimp's good. And then I'll shrink that. You know, there's obviously two kind of hoops there to go on these pins. So you want the open one to go towards the inside. They're all going to just kind of face in towards the inside as we go around. And they fit nice and tightly onto those pins. Make sure all the pins are pushed down in there tightly and that they're all facing in towards each other. Sometimes they might want to roll a little bit on you. You can kind of manipulate them by rolling the wire some back the way you need them. But the idea is just that they're away from the edges because obviously the grommet is pretty thick here. So I chose not to do any silicone on the inside of this grommet just because I don't feel like it really needs it. These holes are super tight. I'm going to put some silicone on the outside. But getting this to fit down inside of here is a little bit tricky. But once you get that in there, you kind of got to use your fingernails to press it around. And there you see it's a nice tight fit. All these wires really don't have much breathing room around them at all. And I'm tugging on that. I mean, not as hard as I can. I'm sure if I did, it would come apart. But I'm putting probably 20 pounds of force on that, and it's not coming apart. So now we can mount this in the Jeep, and you want it to be somewhere where wireless connection can reach this easily. As far as the other ends go, like I mentioned, I used the slightly larger blade terminals for the in and out going to the DC contactor. I used a large ring terminal here, which is going to go on the DC contactor positive, so that's just coming straight from the battery. The ground, so I'm just going to zip screw that into the inner fender somewhere. And then this one I didn't finish up yet, but this is going to have a ring terminal on it that fits one of the terminals here. This is the switch power. So that's going to get a power through the VO switch. So these can be a little bit confusing at first if you've never hooked one up, but I will hopefully take away the confusion for you and show you how to wire this in. I'm going to be remotely mounting this up near my battery inside the engine compartment, and then the cables will just run down to the winch. So it's a really nice clean winch install. Kind of helps you to remote mount a winch a little bit if you wanted to put it in a tighter spot, tucked underneath the frame a little bit or something. And this is a more reliable way to run your winch these days than the probably 4 solenoid pack, which takes up easily 3 times the space or more of this guy. You're going to want to find a good spot for it to mount. You could choose to mount it where your solenoid pack was, and it's obviously going to take up some significantly less space. But I chose to remote mount mine, like I've mentioned, and I wanted it as close to the battery and the winch as possible. So battery is here, winch is of course on the front bumper. So it's not real far, but it's further than you'd think as far as cables go. I think most of them were around 5 feet. So I chose to make this bracket. I'm not going to go into all the fabrication of this really simple bracket because you're going to have to kind of find your own solution here. Hate to say it, but you're on your own a little bit as far as this goes. Possibilities would be mounting it off of the header panel, the inner fender, or possibly even down below the battery if you wanted. This isn't the kind of thing I'm super worried about getting splashed and wet and dunked in water. It's supposed to be very water sealed, but best bet is going to be to have it someplace that it's not constantly just going to be getting beat down with trail debris and moisture. So it mounts to this bracket. See if I can easily kind of show you here. The slots are nice for helping get this where it needs to be. So I can have this one bolt kind of ready to go, the one that's a little harder to get to. Slide that in and then drop the other bolt through. Let's first talk about the top 4 lugs that you have on the DC Contactor. There's green, red, black, and blue markings on this. Red goes to the battery positive. You can also connect your power for the wireless remote off of this. Black does not go to ground on the battery. Black goes to the winch armature. The green and blue lugs connect to F1 and F2 on your winch. You'll need to find out on your specific winch which 2 connections those are and make those directly from the contactor to the winch. Moving on to the 3 blade terminals on the side of the contactor. From left to right, winch in or out, ground in the center, and then winch in or out on the other side. It really doesn't matter which is which, it's just which pin connects from your wireless receiver to the pin on the contactor. If you have them reversed, you can just simply switch them on the contactor here and they'll be then correct. So if your winch out is actually winch in, just flop these terminals around and you'll be in good shape. All right, so you've got 2 ground wires, one that goes to your Harbor Freight wireless receiver, and one that goes to those blade pins on the DC Contactor. I've just chosen to sheet metal screw that right to the header panel here, and that should serve as a perfectly good ground. It's using a stainless steel zip screw. And I'm going to mount the wireless receiver over off of this side of the DC Contactor. I've got my trigger wire to turn that on. And then the other wire that's needed for that is a main power. So constant power to the wireless receiver here. And I'm just going to pull that off of the DC Contactor main. This is direct from the battery here. But I'm just realizing that this should have a fuse in it. So that'll be fused direct from the battery, and then this will have a fuse coming from the VO switch. To mount the receiver next to the contactor, I just made a little bracket that goes on with the mounting bolt of the contactor. And then I used a hose clamp to secure the wireless receiver to that bracket. All right, I got the winch all set up here. Pardon my work in progress winch bumper that I'm making. It'll come together, but I got all the wires nicely tucked in behind the grill here, and they just kind of wrap right around the radiator. There's just enough space in there, and this is the upper coolant hose side, so there's plenty of room for it to move around through there and get to the spot where my DC contactor and winch remote are. And all I got to do is arm it from inside, and then it's ready to go out here. See, I got this all set up with the VO switch, and I've only got two things connected in with this right now: my bumper lights and my winch arm. But VO switch made that nice and simple, and the beautiful thing is, now that I have the VO switch on here, I can easily wire in many other things. So this has been out on one off-roading adventure so far. I checked it afterwards, it stayed dry. And believe it or not, it does fit underneath the hood there. So it's just double-sided tape on top of my battery mount, and that's working out well there. You'll notice too, I tidied things up a little bit with these bus bars, and those are a super nice way to keep everything cleanly mounted. I do want to note though, I'm not running the winch through these. They could probably handle it, but what would be the point of going from battery to these up to the winch, and the possibility for these heating up and causing something else to melt? So not worth it. Winch straight to the battery. I have the military style battery terminals that pretty much you can put 4 things comfortably, 2 on each side, without having any kind of extra bulk or awkward things coming off of those and looking out of place. So yeah, that's kind of my wiring setup there. Clean things up a little bit in here, and the winch again grounds right to the battery, powers right from the battery. So I'm really happy with how that's all come together. The Harbor Freight APEX wireless winch controller really is a excellent option. 60 bucks plus another 40 for the DC contactor if you're upgrading any older winch that doesn't have the solid state electronics in it and doesn't have a wireless remote. This has got to be your cheapest option, and I am super happy with the reliability of it, with the connectivity of it. It's just been all around a great package. The only thing I could possibly ask for better would be to be able to wire it in, but unfortunately that wireless, the wired connector that they give you is not able to be made to work simply with this. So again, it's just probably your best option. Nice little Harbor Freight hack. Hope you guys enjoy it. If you're not subscribed to our channel, please do so, and you get tons of more content like this coming up in your feed. And give our video a thumbs up as well, so that other people will know that it's quality content and they'll be able to watch it as well. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate you. Have a great day.